Volume 3 Chapter 11. With victory over the Baharuth Empire secured and a treaty signed, a new decision had to be made, and Lupus Regina, whether she meant it or not, offered him exactly what he wanted in order to make that decision. An adventure. The various denizens of Nazarick were easily distracted by the sudden explosive growth of new land to govern, and it had been easy to distract both Demiurge and Albedo with projects to survey and establish his kingdom's peacetime government. Ainz himself had his mind on something more. Something even more important to him than ensuring the continued growth of his new team of loyalists. With the bodies of the Empire champions secured, perhaps I can do something with them. Lena's I don't have to worry about, but perhaps turning them to undead. He sighed alone in his room and unfurled the newly made map. The area he ruled now took up a fair amount of area bordering a swamp, the center of which had a truly massive lake. The land to the north of it is mine, but the swamp and lake itself, those belong to the native frogmen and lizardmen. I can't imagine a better place for an adventure. However, it is also true that in Yggdrasil, those were some of the most dangerous places for human players. I'll need security. The decision hardened in Ainz's mind an instant later. Shaltia, he said instantly. I should be able to defeat her handily and disable her ability to escape if I have to, plus we'll be far from home. I can justify a visit on a diplomatic basis. Any doubts were instantly erased. He activated the message spell and reached out to Shaltia Bloodfallen. Shaltia, join me in my office in 10 minutes, and bring Lena's rock bruise with you. There was a moment of silence, and it for one instant Ainz wondered, is there interference with the spell? The wonder was refuted when he heard her squeal with excitement in his head, yes. Of course my lord. I'll be there with Lena's as fast as I can be. The connection was terminated and Ainz left his quarters a moment later. When he arrived at his office, he found Shaltia and Lena's already waiting outside, and unsurprisingly, they were down on their knees. Ainz, for his part, wore not only his rich robes, but also his mask which would obfuscate his change of form. The black fabric danced around his legs until he stopped moving at the door. They were down on both knees and gazing up at him with absolute reverence etched on their faces, eyes wide, staring. Quiet admiration filled their faces with warmth. Little blushes on them both made them appear at once both demure and filled with desire for his grace. Lena's now wore her hair loosened behind her back, baring her once tainted eye. Ainz said nothing. His heart pounded, his heart ached, his heart trembled. He couldn't help but fear the turning of Shaltia's love for him as the child of a dear friend, turning and twisting into hatred. The dread clawed at his soul, though he covered it by turning away from her and opening the door to admit them both at his back. He went to his desk and sat down, folding his gloved hands together. He opened with something passive. Lena's? Ainz asked, and she sank down to both her knees immediately. My lord? She almost squeaked. Are you adapting well? He asked. Why yes of course, my lord. Everyone has been gracious to your servant. She was clearly nervous, a little tremble in her body. She bit her lip. He turned toward Shaltia. Tell me, Shaltia, how do you feel about? He wanted to say humans but instead he substituted, Lena's? She's human. The others are too, but all humans are inferior, they're weak. Not that I doubt my lord's wisdom, but I do find it hard to have any human around without hunger. Lena's didn't flinch away from Shaltia's words, which almost caught him by surprise, but then he realized, they probably had the discussion already. Lena's is brave at least, her courage holds even around my Shaltia. I see. Lena's, when you made your oath to me, you offered me even your body. If that's what I wanted, did you mean it? Ainz asked as clipped as he could, though he blushed behind the mask and shifted his feet like a boy caught stealing cookies out of a cookie jar. Yes. Anything my lord commands. Lena's replied with fiery determination. You've seen the others, the ones who defeated your companions. They were once mere mithril ranks until an experiment here confirmed that I could strengthen them, Ainz said and then waited while she let that sink in. Sink in it did. The blue eyes of the tall blonde woman blinked several times in rapid disbelieving succession. However, we need to know more about how strength is increased. For example, when one becomes another kind of being, what changes? You will be the test subject. Ainz pronounced. He waited for her to ask if it was dangerous, if she had time to prepare. She didn't. Instead Lena's simply lowered her head. I am prepared. Do whatever you want to me, my lord. Shaltia, were the bodies of her comrades recovered? Ainz asked.
Yes, my lord. We've had them preserved for now. But they await your use. Shaltia replied.
Good, Shaltia, you will turn Lena's. Then we will resurrect one of her companions. Lena's will then turn one of her companions. The last to be raised will be kept human, and they will all be subject to training while you and I are gone, and we'll see how strong they all are when you and I return. Ainz explained.
Shaltia felt her rising excitement.
Return? Yes, you will be escorting me into the Great Lake region, and will be responsible for protecting me. Can you do it, or should I ask another? Ainz asked her, and her bright red eyes lit up.
Of course. I can't wait, my lord. I will work myself to the blood and bone for your life. Nothing will harm you, I promise.
She squealed and clapped her hands together as fast as she could, like an overjoyed child given just the right gift on Christmas Day. The sound of her clicking bright red fingernails reminded Ainz of rapid typing on a keyboard, and her fangs were instantly bared and ready. Lena's, for her part, only tilted her head and moved her hair out of the way. You'd think I'd feel like I'd miss my humanity, she said, glancing at her lord from her tilted posture, but I don't think I will. But maybe one more breath for the road, she said with a laugh while Shaltia got up, went behind her, and cradled Lena's body just below her breasts with one arm while the other went up to hold her at the forehead. Lena's inhaled deeply one time, then exhaled, nodded, while Shaltia, who waited for that exhale, touched the tips of her fangs to Lena's neck just over the vein. Lena's lay completely relaxed and at ease, her body in its repose was limp as if she had just died, her eyes closed, the sharp points stung only a little bit at the touch. The beautiful little vampire's long tongue came out and licked over the throat, and where the tongue touched, Lena's felt only numbness, the sort one felt when falling asleep the wrong way on an arm.
Then they sank in.
Her body stiffened at the sudden penetrating sensation. She couldn't see the shifting face of the monster, but she could hear Shaltia's muffled words.
Salty.
Tastes good. Lena's blushed a little at the appraisal by the young vampire of how she tasted. It did answer a long-standing question. When monsters eat us, do they enjoy the taste or is it just a chore for them? At least with vampires, she now knew the answer. The tongue continued to travel over her flesh as the bite tightened and she felt lightheaded as blood intended for her brain was siphoned off to feed a monster. Lena's began to feel weak. Part of her warrior instincts, stiffened her body, urging her to fight. But she proved her courage and restrained herself, forcing her entire body to accept its fate and be food for the monster under the eyes of their common master.
So, I'm dying. I've heard it said that the body dies before a vampire is born. I guess that's true after all. I didn't think it would be this cold. She could see her hand from the way she lay. It was always somewhat pale, but now it was white as a sheet as she lost more and more blood. Then, to her great surprise, the vampire that hated humans, lowered her with great gentleness down to the floor. Lena's lay there, still clad in the simple clothing she'd been given on arrival, a pair of green pants, high riding boots, and a red cloth shirt, each far more comfortable than she'd ever worn, but simple nonetheless. She no longer felt that comfortable cloth, she felt nothing. Nothing but a floating sensation, followed by a sensation of falling deeper and deeper into a black abyss while her eyes closed in her last moment of life. She tried to remain aware, instinctively, without the proper energy to understand her actions or thoughts, her consciousness a mere fog. Perhaps it was a mercy then, that Lena's rock bruise did not feel the actual moment of her death. Volume 3 Chapter 12. The body died. The woman didn't. Lena's eyes opened, and gone were the eyes of bright sky blue, her skin faded, her irises became vertical, her canines grew longer and her hair became dark as night while her skin took on the pallor of the dead after the blood pooled within. She didn't take a first breath. Lena's would never breathe again. When she looked up, the little cute vampire seemed more beautiful than before. Enthralling. Enticing. I want to please her. I want to serve her. I am hers. Forevermore. Those were the first thoughts to radiate upward from the deepest corners of her mind, and with them, Lena's was happy. Mistress. Thank you, Lena's whispered, and the looming blood moon eyes of Shaltia were out of view when Lena's turned her eyes to the masked caster who ruled her now immortal life. My lord. Lena's acknowledged, and though she tried to move quickly, was unable to move beyond a snail's pace. But still, neither critiqued her slowness as she went up to one bended knee and bowed her head, as if they expected her to be sluggish. "How do you feel, Lenas?" Ines asked of her, his voice rich with what she took for concern. "I am. Yes, well. I am wonderful. I feel sluggish, weak, but wonderful, Master," Lenas answered. "You're hungry," Ines said and glanced over to Shaltia. "You have a fountain in your room from which she can feed, don't you?" Shaltia's smile in that moment made his skin instinctively crawl. "She is mine now, is this your intent, Master?" asked. Ines hesitated and pulled up in his memory what he knew of vampire lore. "Yes. I suppose she is. You will be responsible for everything about her, including her advancement in her warrior skills as a vampire knight." Shaltia began to stroke the dark hair at Topplina's head. His skin continued to crawl beneath his robes, and so he raised one gloved finger of his right hand. "You are to see to her instruction. But remember that she came to us of her own accord. You are not to be cruel to her. She is one of us, now." In just that moment, she appeared to be the child her design was intended to mimic. Her head went down and her face screwed up tight in thought, like a child being given instructions on the proper care and feeding of a pet, but unsure if she properly understood. Finally Shaltia raised her head to look at him. "Is it considered cruel to take her chastity?" Ines was silent for a moment as he processed what he'd just heard. The thought came up almost before his understanding did. "Peroncino!" He howled within his mind and failed to entirely keep off the shudder. Shaltia appeared not to notice, but under his eyes the new vampire had entirely pressed her head into the hand of the one to remake her and was rubbing affectionately even when Shaltia's hand ceased to move on its own, like each role was programmed into the other. He put a hand over his mask and sighed, "Don't order her to ask for that. Don't force her to do that. And I will leave you to your happiness." Ines swallowed hard, regretting the decision already touching his anxiety-laden head. "Damn it, Peroncino. Did you just paste the wiki list of fetishes into her flavor text?" He mocked the statement, but then on second thought, that is probably exactly what he did. "Thank you, Master," Lenas and Shaltia said in the same moment, and each bowed their heads with gratitude. Ines closed the hand over his mask into a fist and cleared his throat with a needless cough. A deep desire to be away from the promise of future perversion ran through his blood. "Be that as it may, you will be accompanying me as my personal security, while Lena's will remain here. Take 5 minutes, instruct her on what to do, then follow through the gate after me. A leg up on the succubus bitch." Shaltia considered with raw excitement, both mental and physical, coursing through her body, a flood of desire exciting her loins. Ines was gone through the gate spell a moment later. When Shaltia was alone with her new pet, she giggled and cupped Lena's cheeks. "I'm going to give you some instructions for while I'm gone. But while I'm talking, get under my dress and keep your mouth moving too. The pleasure will be your reward. Work hard for me to please the Lord of Nazareth, and I will show you heaven." Lena's didn't answer verbally, she only moved to obey while she listened to her mistress speak. Zariasu held his sword out as the dragon Tusk tribe surrounded the would-be combatants. "Will it be to the death?" he asked his towering opponent. "Only if you die before you give up," Zamburu replied and struck a posture with his large fist up and smaller one back. Zariasu wasn't sure if the warrior was joking or not, but at ease with monsters, he relaxed his body and prepared to strike. "You, woman, start the fight," Zamburu said to the watching Crush Lulu. She blushed faintly at the cheeks at his blunt address. "Begin," she said a moment later, and the two warriors clashed. The fist of the monk came towards Zariasu's head with blinding speed. "Icy burst," Zariasu shouted as the spray of icy fog shot up around him, in a burst of white. At the same time he was ducking to avoid the blow and spun outward, swinging the blade up and striking the dominant arm of Zamburu. The sword stopped dead as if he'd struck a stone. "Monk. He's hardened his body. This won't be easy." Zamburu showed no sign of pain, responding by spinning around and striking Zariasu in the side with his tail, sending the warrior falling. Cheers went up from the Dragon Tusk members, but those cheers faded when Zariasu rose to his feet and immediately charged. The bearer of Frostpain proved his mettle, avoiding another punch by so narrow a span that he felt the air whistle past the side of his head, then leaping up at the taller lizard man and hitting Zamburu's jaw. Zariasu's skull felt the impact of the powerful jaw,
but though it rattled him to hit something as hard as a monk body, it clearly caught the chief unexpectedly.
Zhenbroo staggered back. He tasted blood.
"I've bitten off my tongue," he realized when the severed part fell to the dirt, where it was promptly stomped on by the advancing Zariasu.
He felt frost pain hit him again. "I need to stop this, to get a grip on him. He's a great warrior. I can concede now." He snatched at Zariasu's sword hand and yanked it up high, then bent it back, snapping it hard enough that out of the corner of his eyes he could see his own people collectively wince. It had the desired effect. Zariasu dropped the sword. Zhenbroo then opened his mouth to speak, and realized the catch-22. He needed to speak, and couldn't. "He's going to bite my neck? He's going to kill me?" Zariasu realized in a moment of disbelief. He caught the sword in his other hand while pain radiated down his arm from the one with the broken wrist, and in a desperate thrust, his sword went through Zhenbroo's mouth and emerged out the back of his neck. The tribe's maws collectively dropped as the bright blue blade pierced their chief through and through, the faint fog of ice emerging around it freezing the scales it touched. The hand holding Zariasu's wrist dropped to the side of Zhenbroo's body, while Zariasu's heart raced and blood pumped through his veins more powerfully than the pain from his injury could flow. He was breathing hard when he drew the sword out, and no longer holding up the body of the chief, it toppled forward with a heavy wet splat. Blood dripped off the blade of blue, dripping down into the wet ground. Chest rising and falling, heart still racing on, Zariasu held up the sword in front of himself, and Crush Lulu rushed from where she stood alone, to stand with him. She glanced around at the tribe that stood utterly silent, staring at the body. Anyone else?" Zariasu demanded. A dragon tusk druid approached, dark scales, muscular and holding a wooden staff. He stood beside the body of the chief, crouched down, rolled the fallen warrior onto his back, and with trembling finger claws, he closed the two wide and empty eyes. "The dragon tusk follows the strong. The one who kills Zhenbroo, the bearer of frost pain, is a great warrior. And we will follow." The old druid began to pound his chest with the fist which held the staff, and the gesture was slowly taken up by the tribe, until there was only the sound of pounding fists, and the dragon tusk hailed their new chief. He leaned back and looked down to where Crush Lulu stood. The healing light of her magic had already begun to erase the pain and heal his injured body. Her red eyes met his when she felt them on her, and he said, "You now have 3 allies." Volume 3 Chapter 13. Ainz didn't have to wait long for Shaltia to join him, but when she did, her face was flushed a bright strawberry red and she was breathing hard. "Shaltia, are you well?" he asked. Under the immune to disease, she should not be sick. Oh. Wonderful Lord Ainz. Just. Making sure that Lena's understood everything expected of her in so short a time was very difficult, she said with a tiny giggle that led to her bringing a hand up to demurely cover her ruby lips. "I see. If you need more time for her instruction, I can wait a little longer." Ainz raised a gloved hand, gesturing to the empty space where she could cast a gate spell and return if she wished. Shaltia violently shook her head. No need, my lord," Shaltia exclaimed and stepped closer to him, the soft ground giving under her dainty feet. "Being with you it is my greatest happiness, and keeping a supreme being waiting would be unpardonable." "I see, well then." Ainz trailed off to look around the landscape. The ground was soft beneath his sandals' feet and there was a superabundance of trees amidst a swampy area with many thick and winding paths of thick moss and brown muck amidst the bushes. Please don't force me to fight you." Up close, she looked so small, so innocent, a perfect Victorian-era child. Perroncino had outdone himself on her, every dream of youth or beauty, every ideal girl he'd ever dreamed of. He had made her utterly adorable, her porcelain pale skin, her wide bell-shaped red dress, and her demure childlike demeanor. "I know what she is by nature, but I know what she is to me. The child of one of my dearest friends, his last legacy, and the latter means so much more." It was that thought which kept him weak at heart. Despite being behind his red and white mask, he felt exposed to her, even though she only looked up with quiet, hopeful expectation, unsure of the cause for his silence. He reached out and put a hand on the base of her flowing white hair. Feeling the need to say something as she gave a joyful smile that was colored by confusion at the sudden affectionate display, Ainz spoke to her. "I will be relying on you. We don't know what is out there, so be cautious. I don't want my children hurt."
Ainz explained, and Shaltia could only nod her head in silence. Send out your household, search for threats or signs of intelligent life. Ainz gave the order more for the sake of giving her a command to carry out, and then watched as white wolves and black bats rushed into the nearby unknown lands ahead of them both. The bushes and trees rattled with the pursuit of anything, a few brief howls went up out of sight, then a sickening chewing sound, then the sound like tearing paper that could only be the tearing of flesh. The household of the true vampire proved effective at ferreting out anything that was a waste of time, and at a gesture from Ainz when Shaltia looked up at him for permission again, she stepped forward. Ainz followed her, into the shadows and the night that existed in the middle of the day, beneath the thick green canopy above that covered the forest and swamp like a sky of green and shadow. Advancing through the wood beneath the overlaying canopy, Ainz couldn't help but think of Blue Planet. If he were here, even with everything else, he would be overjoyed. He would want to protect this world from the harm that these other beings will bring to it. But then, this same world would harm my friend's children. The theocracy despises non-humans, most humans despise heteromorphs, and both demi-humans and heteromorphs hate each other and humans alike. I can't allow them to come to harm. Ainz turned that thought over in his head until he felt a slight tug on his sleeve. Shaltia had her hand on her cheek and she was looking demurely down at an angle toward the wet ground. Forgive my lewd forwardness, my lord, but my servants seem to have found something. Something? Ainz snapped out of his private reverie and looked into the deep darkness. Yes, my lord. A demi-human, a lizard man, he is badly wounded, he is alone and he is being chased. Should I kill him? Shaltia asked after informing him, and licked her ruby lips. No, I would rather question him. We're better off making friendly contact. What is chasing him? Ainz asked curiously. Shazariu felt life and consciousness continued to bleed out of his body with every step. How long have I been running? How long? 1 day? 2? 3? I'm tired. Behind him lay the bodies of most of the warriors who had traveled with him. They lay spread out over miles, their bodies mutilated, defiled, and ruined. Trying to use their screams in the forest to torment me, to draw me out. Last night had been the same. Howls from one of his brethren, the rising smoke and the smell from the wind told him what was happening. Roasting him alive. Shazariu shuddered, it was a horrible way to die. Come back. Come back and we'll spare him. Come back and turn yourself in, return our comrade and we won't kill you. Their ribbity croaking voices haunted the hours of darkness. But he held firm in his resolve. Surrender will accomplish nothing, as long as I'm running they'll think I've got their comrade. I have to buy time. Shazariu told himself, and so buy time he did. The few who caught up with him, he killed, their bodies littered the hidden landscape. And still, Shazariu ran. Monsters. He realized an instant later. Without panicking he scrambled up the nearest tree, his jaw clenched against the pain raging through his trembling, wounded limbs. He continued to go up. They may or may not smell me, but at least I can fight from here. I never expected to die this way, on the run, well away from home. Perhaps I'll get lucky and these beasts will attack the frogman too. His mouth fell open in a silent laugh as he drew his weapon and dug one claw into the thick bark of the tree. He swayed a little, unsteady and exhausted, only the fear and his denial of it kept him awake and ready to fight for just one moment more. Come on. Come on you dirty bee. He stopped his muttered taunt, when white wolves and vicious-looking bats emerged, but showed no interest in him. The screaming bats enveloped him for only a moment before they flew on, the wolves snarling, vicious growls, with hungry barks approached, ran under, and ran on. The noise of their paws rustling and their big bodies crashing through the brush was replaced by the rough screams of frogmen. Shazariu watched from his place in the tree. From where he stood he could see the flight of blood arching through the air like a green rainbow and turn the dirt to mud. And yet somehow, the lizardman chieftain could only feel certainty of the frogman's death. He didn't take advantage of the moment to run. I can't outrun those things anyway. But I don't think I want to test their friendliness without their master. So, he gingerly sat down, letting his tail wrap around the thick branch on which he stood and keeping his claw dug into the trunk of the tree, he waited. The beasts began their return. The bats circled just out of his reach, their constant screaming sending shivers down his spine, and the white wolves laid down around the trunk, lowering their heads down to their paws, and waited. At least they don't plan on killing me yet. Thanks be to the gods for small favors. Shazariu thought, but kept his eyes moving down below and around him where the bats acted with the wolves to create a cage of flesh and teeth that he couldn't hope to penetrate. "Wow, so you're half dead." Shaziryu snapped his head back to look up. A small human-looking girl in a curious red and black dress that had the base remain up around her ankles rather than falling down over her head. She was smiling at him and had bright red vampiric eyes. If he could have paled, he would have. As it was, his heart raced. She licked her lips in a very slow, languorous fashion. His legs felt like they were weighed down by lead. "I would use a spell on you, but you know I just spared you, don't you?" Shaltia asked, her eyes mere inches from his own. Shaziryu bowed his head. "Thank you." That seemed to please her. She smiled, exposing her fangs. "You are polite. Good. Now can you get down from this tree yourself, or do I need to help you?" He pointed down at the wolves. "Will they attack if I get down on my own?" Shaziryu asked. The vampire waved her hand and began walking upside down along the overhead branch, stepped onto the trunk and began to pace down. Before her fourth step the various creatures vanished into nothingness. "I can get down. But where am I? Where are we going?" Shaziryu struggled to keep his heart from exploding in his chest. His tail, fingers, toes, everything twitched and trembled. "Where else? To meet the one who ordered me to save you. Come along, we don't want to keep him waiting," she said and hopped with childlike gentleness from her place walking down the trunk, back down to her feet. Shaziryu clambered down, groaning as he walked, and did his best to follow after her.